Our co-lead of the Vision team, Linnea Good, will introduce you to our keynote speaker. Linnea is a singer-songwriter from Summerland, British Columbia, a master biblical storyteller, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that she's co-minister of Ukulele Church. She will also begin the session by telling a selection of scripture chosen by Rabbi Goldstein. And so now I hand it over to Linnea.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I am so pleased and honored to open this keynote hour in our festival and to introduce our theme presenter, Rabbi Elise Goldstein. This year, our Vision team has really been contemplating, hi Rabbi, our team has really been contemplating the question, how does having a story at the center of our faith shape us as a community? Because it could have been otherwise. What is a story for? And so what is the storyteller doing for the community? And it seemed to us that nobody was better equipped to teach us about that than the Jewish community. A number of years ago, David and I, my partner, had experienced the keynote leadership of a fabulous rabbi at an event centered on the story of Esther. It was very exciting. And so last spring, way back last spring, our team invited Rabbi Elise Goldstein to come and speak to us at this festival. At 13, our speaker told her rabbi that she wanted to be a rabbi, which caused a stir. And in 1983, she was ordained and became the first woman rabbi in Canada after that. A Canadian Reformed Jewish rabbi of City Shul in Toronto, Rabbi Goldstein is an internationally recognized speaker, spiritual leader, innovative educator, and author of 4 books and many articles. She's been recognized for her work by organizations at every level, has an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from Toronto Metropolitan University. She's recognized for her teaching, her community development work, the quality of her thought. In the midst of the tensions that are going on in the world, and especially in the Middle East, the physical violence and the clash of ideologies, even here in Canada, we want to pay attention to our scriptures, to our stories, to our faith, and our shared humanity. Rabbi Goldstein, we so look forward to your helping us learn about our story in the midst of God's story. So welcome to you.
Thank you so much. I am so honored and excited to be able to be with you all today.
Well, I am going to begin this session by telling a text from the Torah, which Rabbi Goldstein asked me to present. It is both creation stories of Genesis 1 and 2. So I advise you to sit back and hear the word. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the waters, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that it was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light the day and called the darkness the night. And so there was evening and there was morning, a first day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse to separate water from water." And so God created an expanse, and it separated the water that was below the expanse from the water that was above the expanse. And God called the expanse sky. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Then God said, "Let the waters that are below the expanse be gathered together into one place so that the dry land may appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land the earth and called the gatherings of waters the seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation, seed-bearing plants of every kind, fruit trees with fruit bearing seeds. And it was so. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a third day. Oh, then God said, oh, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. And it was so. They will serve as signs for the days and for the years, and they'll also serve to shine light upon the earth. And it was so. God created the two great lights, the one to dominate the day, the greater one, and the lesser one to dominate the night. And God put them in the expanse of the sky to shine light upon the earth, to dominate the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And there was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Then God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures and birds that fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. And God created the great sea monsters and all the living creatures that creep upon the earth, which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all the winged birds of the earth. And God saw that those were good. And God blessed them and said, fill the earth, be fertile, increase, fill the waters of the sea, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. Then God said, then let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle, creeping things, wild beasts of every kind. And it was so. God made the wild beasts of every kind, the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth. And God said, it is good. Then God said, let's create humankind in our image, in our likeness. No, they will rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and all the cattle, the whole earth, all the creeping things. And so God created humankind in the divine image, created it in the image of God, creating them male and female. And God blessed them and said, be fertile and increase in the earth, master it. Rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living creature. So now see, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is on the earth, and every tree that has fruit with a seed in it, they shall be yours for food. And to all the animals of the land, all the birds of the air, and everything that creeps on the land that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. And when God saw all that had been made, God found it very good. There was evening and there was morning, a sixth day. Well, the heavens and the earth were finished in all their array. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that had been undertaken. God ceased from doing the work of creation on the seventh day. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, having ceased on it from doing all the work. Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created, when God made earth and heaven. When no shrub of the field had yet appeared on earth, when no grass of the field had yet sprouted because God hadn't made the rain to come upon the land, and there were no humans to till the soil. But a flow would well up from the ground and water the surface of the earth. Then God created the human from the soil's humus, blowing into his nostrils the breath of life. And the human became a living being. And God created a garden in Eden in the east, and placed the human in the center of the garden. And then from out of the ground, God caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and that is good for food. And in the middle of it, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. There is a river that flows from Eden to water the garden. And from there, it divides into 4 branches. The name of the first is Pishon, the one that winds through the land of Havilah, where the gold is. The gold there is good. There's bdellium and there's lapis lazuli. The name of the second is Gishon, the one that winds through the land of Cush. The name of the third is Tigris, the one that flows east of Ashur. And the name of the fourth is the Euphrates. Now God settled the human in the garden to till it and to tend it. And God commanded the human, of every tree in this garden you may freely eat, but as for the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, you shall not eat of it, for on the day that you eat of it, you shall die. And God said, it's not good for the human to be alone. I should make a fitting counterpart for him. And so God created all the wild beasts and all the birds of the air and brought them to the human to see what he would call them. And whatever the human called them, that's what their name would be. And the human gave names to all the birds of the air and all the wild beasts, but no fitting counterpart for the human was found. And so God cast a deep sleep upon the human. And while he slept, God took one of his sides and then closed up the flesh at the site. And then from the side that was taken from the human, God created woman. And bringing her to the human said, at last, this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for from a human she was taken. Hence, a man may leave his mother and his father and cling to his wife, and the two become one flesh. Now, the two were naked, the human and his wife, and they felt no shame. Amen.
Thank you so much for that beautiful telling. And let me begin by saying how I'm going to relate to that telling in just a moment. But I feel like we need to begin our journey together to understand the Jewish roots of storytelling in the Bible and the way that Jews use the biblical story with a blessing, with a very traditional Jewish blessing. So I'm going to invite people to take this blessing in. It is the blessing that Jews use every time we study Torah. Now, I'm going to use the word Torah and Tanakh a lot during our presentations, and there is a slide with helpful translation of what I mean when I say Torah and Tanakh. But I'll just quickly let you know that I'll be talking about the full Jewish Bible, which is called the Tanakh in Hebrew, and I'll be talking about the 5 books of Moses, which is called the Torah. And I'm going to use those Jewish terms rather than English terms or terms that have been used, which Jews don't use, terms like Old Testament, which Jews we don't use about our own scripture. So this blessing will situate us, and I'll do it first in Hebrew, and then I'll do it in English. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the eternal God-loving Spirit of the universe, who has sanctified us through commandments and commanded us to engage in, to deeply investigate, to understand, and to soak in, la'asok, the words of Torah. Amen. Now, why did I ask for the telling to be about Genesis in my first session, which is about the problems, the challenges of telling a biblical story in translation? Because the translations of the first two stories of Genesis are the underpinnings of just about everything we do in religious tradition. And they are also the underpinnings of both patriarchy and our ecological crisis. Because of the way that we've translated this story and told it and promulgated it from our pulpits, so many questions arise in how we live our lives. So I'm just going to point out some of the challenges of translating that beautiful epic telling that Linnea did. The very first word, day, and there was evening and there was morning, the first day, yom in Hebrew, from the root yam, which also means river or water. What were the sea monsters and why were they good? Why do we translate Adam as Adam, as if God gave this first human being a name, Adam, like Bob or Jim or something else? And why do we translate the word Adam, human being, which comes from the root Adama, or earth, not as earthling, which is exactly what Adam means. So if Eve or Chava is, or source of all life, which is what Eve's name in Hebrew means, she should really be called not Eve, which means evening, but source of all life, Chava, from Chai, to live. Why was she created from the side of the earthling, from earth? Again, all of these translations are become so political. What does it mean to be a fitting counterpoint? In Hebrew, ezer kenegdo, a helper against him. When you look back at the Hebrew source of the way we've translated, what questions come up for us? And so that's what we're going to do for our little bit of time together this morning, is talk about how translations have underpinned some of our misunderstandings of what Torah and Tanakh are trying to teach us. And what is the problem of telling a biblical story in English and not in its original, at least from the Jewish Bible's point of view, in its original Hebrew? So let me just give you a very quick history timeline of biblical translations. And within that, you'll see where the challenge lies. So I'm sure you all know that the first translation of the Bible was the Septuagint, and that actually was a Jewish translation. And when I say Jewish translation, it means it was translated by Jews with the agenda of making the Bible available to the Jewish people. So Septuagint, 70, the legend is that 70 elders were called together. This is about the 3rd century before the Common Era, BCE. And 70 elders were called together from Jerusalem to translate the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, into Greek. Now, we don't see another Jewish translation, that is a translation done by Jews for the Jewish community. We do not see another Jewish translation until 1853. So I want you to go with me from 2nd century or 3rd century before the Common Era to 19th century of the Common Era. Why was there no attempt to translate the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, into English or any other language? You know, of course, that the first English translation of the Bible, 1530, Tyndale, was translated, and the controversy was that he translated it from not only the Greek of the Septuagint, but the Hebrew, the original Hebrew. So just let's remember what it means to use a translation of a translation of a translation. So there's no Jewish translation really for us to look at until 1853 into English. And then that's not even the translation that the Jewish community uses anymore. It was translated by a man named Isaac Leeser, but we use the original Jewish Publication Society translation, which was 1917. So let's say there was no Jewish translation until 1917 that was used by the Jewish community. Why? First of all, in most of history, although today is a little bit different, in most of history, most Jews were literate in Hebrew. And so why do you need to translate the Bible into English when you understand it in its original language? Remember, Hebrew was our prayer language. We used it every day, 3 times a day for our prayer services. We didn't pray in English until the Reform movement began that tradition in the late 19th century. So most Jews were literate in Hebrew, and a translation of the Bible was considered only for the unschooled, for someone who couldn't read or understand Hebrew, and that was almost unheard of. Remember that reward in the Jewish tradition goes to those who are learned, not those who are rich, those who are studied, not those who are politicians or rock stars. And so it was very important to be literate in Hebrew. The second reason we don't see a lot of Jewish translations is because we accept that the original is always better than the translation, and easier to understand when you understand the original language. And we accept the holiness of the original, and that the holiness gets watered down as it goes from translation to translation to translation, from Greek to Latin to English. Third reason is because there's just too many Jewish dialects. What would we have translated it into? Jews didn't speak English really until the 20th century. So there were many, many Jewish dialects throughout the world. There is a Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo called Ladino, Judeo-Spanish dialect. Of course, there's Yiddish, which was the daily spoken language of the Jews of Eastern Europe for millennia. English was not the lingua franca, the normal spoken language of the Jews until the 19th century. And so why would we bother to translate the Bible into English? It wasn't the way that we spoke. The fourth reason is probably the most important, and that is because of Tyndale. We in the Jewish community felt, or scholars in the Jewish community felt, that the Christological translations, the purposeful Christological translations, which were inserted into the translation, were problematic for us. And I'm going to go over some of those for you so you'll understand where I'm coming from. And the last reason is because in Jewish tradition, commentary on the Bible is considered the same as translation. It's considered a form of translation. So this leads me to the theme of this morning. And if you remember nothing else of what I've told you, memorize this statement. All translation is interpretation. All translation is interpretation. Now, I don't care whether you're translating Shakespeare into French or whether you're translating a medieval Arabic poem into English, or whether you're translating common parlance into another language. All translation is interpretation. Choosing to translate the earthling as human, or Adam, a proper name, is a form of interpretation. Even translating the tree of knowledge is interpretation, because Eitz Hada'at in Hebrew, da'at has two meanings. One is intellectual knowledge, and one is sexual knowledge, or sexual intimacy, I should say. Because later on in Genesis, it'll say that the male knew his wife, knew his partner, and that same word is used, that same word for knowledge. So sexual intimacy between two people is a kind of a knowledge. So the tree of knowledge and all of the sexual underpinnings of Genesis, therefore, and the sexual underpinnings of sin in Genesis, or at least the Christian understanding of that, is pinned on the translation of the tree of knowledge, what that knowledge means. And so all translation is interpretation. That's the first thing I want you to remember. The second thing I want you to remember, so now I've said if you forget everything, just remember that, but add to that one other thing, and that is every translation depends on context. Every translation depends on context. You've all seen Romeo and Juliet reimagined as West Side Story. You've all seen different Shakespeare plays put into the modern context. And sometimes they lose something because Verona actually was not the same as New York City. So everything depends on context. Now that brings us to the biggest challenge of telling a story in translation. Because how do we know the context of the story? We can only know the context of a story when we understand what the story means. But how do we know what it means? What if you don't know what a phrase means? How do you tell it then in translation? So how do we, in the Jewish community, in our Torah study, how do we try and figure out what a word means and what its context is? And now I'm going to give you some examples. And by the way, I want to say that if you're finding it hard to take notes and remember all the biblical verses I'm going to give you, Linnea has my notes and it has all the verses on it. And after we're done, I'm happy for you to have all of that. So don't worry about, wait, I want to listen to her, but at the same time, I want to write down Genesis 41:7. So we'll be able to do this together later. So how do we find out what a biblical verse means? And I'm talking to you as Christian biblical storytellers who want to tell the story in its correct translation. How can I help you know what its correct translation is? So I'm going to give you now 4 ways that we do this and the 4 challenges. The first is we look at other sources for the same story. So we'll, for example, if a story appears twice in the Torah, we'll look at it both times. So Noah's Ark, the story of Noah's Ark, for example, appears 3 different times in 3 different ways, okay, in the book of Genesis. So we'll look at the different ways the story is told. And sometimes a word changes from one story, the way the story is told one time to another. Now, you'll find this in the Tanakh in many ways because the prophets retell stories from the Torah. And sometimes a detail is changed or retranslated or reinterpreted by the prophetic retelling. So the prophets, for example, tell a lot of stories of what happened in the desert in the book of Exodus. You have to look at both stories to figure out what exactly is the context and the meaning of a phrase. We'll look at other ancient Semitic languages to understand what a Hebrew word means. Now, of course, the biblical translators all did that. But before we can really feel confident in the way we're translating a phrase, we, at least from the Jewish tradition, we will look at other Semitic languages, Akkadian, Egyptian. There are even Egyptian words in the Torah. So, for example, when Joseph is elevated in the book of Genesis, when Joseph is elevated by the Pharaoh to be his second in command, they parade him through the streets and they cry, abrek, abrek. Well, nobody knows what abrek means because it is an Egyptian word. We'll look at rabbinic sources. We'll look at what the ancient rabbis commentated. And often the ancient rabbis will translate from Hebrew to another Hebrew. They'll say, oh, that word means, and then they'll explain it. And then, of course, we have commentators like Rashi from medieval France. He's in the 11th century of the Common Era. He will translate a word in Hebrew into Old French. So if your Old French is good, that can be helpful sometimes, your medieval French. And of course, we have the most famous translation, which is called the Targum, or Onkelos, 2nd century of the Common Era, who translates into Aramaic. So if your Aramaic is good, that can be helpful. The second way we'll figure out what a word means, because by the way, even fluent Hebrew speakers and even modern Israelis cannot translate the Torah because words change their context. So I'll give you an example. In Genesis 43, verse 11, we have a list of foods that Joseph's brothers bring down to Egypt from Canaan. And there's one word there called botnim, Genesis 43:11. Now, in modern Hebrew, botnim means peanuts. So when you go to the corner store in Tel Aviv, you ask for botnim. But it didn't mean peanuts because there were no peanuts in the Middle East in the days of Joseph. So it actually is pistachios. Now, you say to me, okay, what's the big difference if I tell that story and I use the word pistachio or I use the word peanut? Well, it does make a difference because the context of the story is that peanuts are cheap. They're common. They're nothing. But in its day, pistachios were luxury. They were luxurious. They were expensive. So again, if you're telling the story and you say peanuts, the modern hearer is going to hear, oh, cheap. They went to the Costco and they got a big bag of peanuts. But when you hear pistachios, you say, they took a little extra effort to bring something a little more special. So you can't use modern Hebrew to translate the Bible. That's my second point. Modern Hebrew won't help you. You're Aramaic, you're Akkadian, you're Egyptian. May not help you. The third way that we figure out what a word means is we look at other instances when it's used, as I said before. But there are words in the Bible that only appear once. The great word for that, I'm sure you learned this in seminary if you're ordained, is hapax legomenon, right? So hapax legomenon is a word, and you're sure Linnea is shrugging, so maybe you didn't learn that word in seminary or you don't remember it. So hapax legomenon is a word that appears in the Bible once, the whole Tanakh, okay? And that could be really a problem for translation. So I'll give you two good examples. One is Genesis chapter 6, verse 16. In the ark of Noah, there is a sohar, translated as window, translated as light, translated as opening. What was the sohar that was in? And the Bible wants us to know that in that ark, there was a sohar. And the commandment to build the ark includes the commandment to put a sohar in it. We have no idea what sohar is because it only appears there once. And there's no dictionary that can tell us what it is. The second example is Numbers chapter 4, verse 6. That's the list of materials that the Israelites are going to use to build the desert tabernacle, the mikdash. And one of those materials is a tachash, which is translated as dolphin skins, right? And whenever you're telling the story of how they were building the tabernacle, you're going to say, and they built it with poles and dolphin skins. Okay, we have no idea what tachash is. Oh, anyway, it's just a guess. That was dolphin skins. And of course, where do they get dolphin skins from in the middle of the desert? Because they weren't at the beach. They were in the middle of the desert. So did they take the dolphin skins with them from when they crossed the Red Sea in the Exodus story? Did they skin those dolphins and take the dolphin skins with them? Hard to know. And the fourth thing that we do when we do biblical translation is we have the challenge that some words have two distinctly different meanings. So I'm going to give you 4 examples. One example is the word kos for cup in the Joseph story. Remember the butler who has elevated the cup. The kos in the Joseph story means cup, Genesis 40, verse 11. But in Leviticus, it appears in the list of non-kosher animals as a bird. So was there a cup in the prison with Joseph, or was there an unkosher bird? Second example is the word zemer, which is translated as the word song. And that's used a lot in the Psalms. For example, in Psalm 71:3. But it's actually also used for the word strength. In Exodus 15, God is my strength. Oziv Zimrat Yah. And weirdly enough, in the book of Genesis 43, it's used as produce of the land. So is it a song? Is it strength? Or is it produce of the land? Third example, the word bayit in Hebrew. Bayit generally means house. It can also mean part of the body. It can also mean a specific room. It can mean a dynasty, and it can mean a family. As in Deuteronomy 14, you and your bayit shall rejoice. What does that mean? You and your bayit shall rejoice. You and your body shall rejoice. You and a room in your house shall rejoice. You and your house shall rejoice. You and your dynasty shall rejoice, or you and your family shall rejoice. Again, important how we translate to tell the story. And last example is the word zera, which means seed. And we saw that in your telling of Genesis, a fruit-bearing, seed-bearing tree. So zera means an agricultural tree, but it also means your child or your descendant. So it's so beautiful to figure out which way the Torah is trying to teach us. Now, let's talk about what's lost in translation. And I love the way you told that biblical text. But I just want us to be very aware that when we're telling the Bible in English, we're going to lose things in translation. 5 things that are lost in translation I think we should pay attention to. The first is Christian translations use their own numbering of verses, and Jewish translations use different numberings of verses. So when you're telling the 10 Commandments, which version are you using? The original version, which is the Jewish numbering, or the Christian version, which is the different numbering of those 10 Commandments? Second challenge of what is lost in translation. Hebrew names have meaning. Every name in the Bible means something. Isaac in Hebrew means laughter, because Sarah was told she was going to have a kid in her 90s. And when he came out, she laughed. And she named him Laughter, because she was incredulous that she had a baby. Calling him Isaac just loses that. So if, again, people don't know that the word Isaac, Yitzchak in Hebrew means she laughed, loses something in the translation. And all the names of those rivers in Genesis, each one means something very special. And as I told you before, the name Adam means earthling. And the name Eve in Hebrew, Chava, means life. I think that our telling would be different if we used those translations for people's names. The third that's lost in transliteration is the beautiful alliteration and word plays we have in Hebrew, right? The ch sound, which is hard for people to make, but it's a hard sound, and it's meant to be a hard sound when you have a verse in Hebrew with, let's say, 5 ch sounds in a row. In Hebrew, we pay attention to that alliteration. It's trying to teach us something. The word me in Hebrew, which means who, often also means the one that, and often reappears in a verse. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar ba'kodesh. In the book of Exodus, who is like you, O God among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness? Actually doesn't mean who there. It means you. You are the one. So, but that alliteration of the me several times is lost. And there are fabulous word plays in Hebrew that are lost in the English. The fifth is punctuation, is interpretation, because remember, in the Torah scroll itself, the way a Torah scroll is written in Hebrew, there is no punctuation. It's just word after word after word after word after word after word. From in the beginning, the first word, which by the way doesn't mean necessarily in the beginning, but in the beginning of, to the last word, Moses. It's just one big line. Now, the Torah is written in columns when it's written on a parchment scroll, but there's no commas, there's no periods, there's no exclamation points. So I love the way you told it, Linnea, because you put in the periods and the commas and the exclamation points, but they're not there. They're not in the original text. So whatever periods and commas and exclamation points we add is our own interpretation of the story. And last, what we lose in telling a story in translation is stylistic. Do you want to be more literal or more idiomatic? Because the literal meaning of the Hebrew sometimes is stilted, right? But the idiomatic use of the Hebrew can also be incorrect. So I'll give you a good example. Genesis 27, verse 41. Vayomer Esav belibo, and Esau spoke to his heart, is what it really means, right? Vayomer, to speak, Esav, Esau, belibo, in his heart. But it's translated as, he said to himself. So it's idiomatically, you can say, he said to himself, and literally you can say, he spoke to his heart. Which one do you want to choose? And last but not least, what's the agenda of the translation? This is really important to ask. What's the agenda of the translation? Is it to edify the text? Is it to teach the text? Is it to convince the listener of something? or is it to convert the listener? So this is where we get into political, purposeful mistranslations. So for example, Genesis 2:18. God creates this female being, Ezer Kenegdo, which has been translated from the King James and onward as she is created to be a helpmeet for him. Ezer Kenegdo, a helpmeet for him. That's the word Ezer, right? Ezer means to help. Kenegdo means against him, opposite him, on the other side of him. But translating that as helper or helpmeet has colored the way we look at the role of women throughout history. If we were created to be a helper for him, well, that is pretty clear an agenda for our patriarchal understanding. So how do I feel about this as a feminist? It's going to color the way I read this verse. God created her as Ezer Kenegdo, a helpmeet, which is the traditional translation. This foundational story then has two different ways of reading it. They're both very reasonable, that the woman was created to help the man, and that the woman was created to goad the man, or to be opposite him, or to be different from him. They're both reasonable, but they color the way we see the world. And so I'm going to end with the problematic Christian translations of certain verses which are used as conversionary texts. So the first one is Isaiah 7:14, of course. Assuredly, my sovereign will give you a sign. Look, the Alma is going to give birth, and she will give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel. So the translation of that word Alma into virgin changes the way everybody sees that Isaiah 7 text. But the word Alma in Hebrew means young woman. And the word for virgin used purposely in the Torah, especially around the laws of marriage and the laws of rape in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, is Bitulah. Bitulah is a virgin. Alma is a young woman. Could be a young married woman. It could be a young woman who has had sex many times. Alma means young woman. Now, the context is the Arameans have plotted against the Israelites. And God is assuring the Israelites that they will succeed in this battle. And the sign for their succeeding in this battle is that this young woman will give birth, and she'll call her son Emmanuel. Where did the word virgin come from? And how do you tell that story in Isaiah? Where you know that the Greek translation as Parthenos from Matthew 1:22 is a purposeful translation of the word young woman into virgin. The masculine form of the noun Alma, young woman, is Elam, which means simply a young man. So the masculine form of that word in Isaiah is never used to mean virgin, always used to mean young man, Elam. And the feminine form of that word, Alma, is always translated in the Jewish Bible through the whole Tanakh as young woman, and yet through the Greek translation as Parthenos or virgin, and the Matthew translation, Matthew picking up that translation, therefore means you tell the story as a virgin giving birth, or Christians tell the story. Now the word appears twice. So remember I said look for it in other places in the Bible. The word appears twice else to help us out in 1 Samuel 17:56 and in 1 Samuel 20:22. And by the way, all Christian Bibles correctly translate the word Elam as young man or lad, never as virgin. So there's the best, most famous question of context and translations and how that changes the way we see a verse and the way we tell a verse. I'm going to end and leave time for the response. I'm going to end here with the danger of mistranslation. And this is my favorite one. And I think you'll really appreciate this one. Exodus 34. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to receive the word of God. What's called the Ten Commandments, but what we understand to be the whole Torah. Moses goes up Mount Sinai, and when he comes down, he is a light. He is glowing. Now, who wouldn't be? He has just seen God face to face. He has just received the Torah. He what comes down Mount Sinai, and the Hebrew says his face is a light. His face has rays of light. And in the Hebrew, keren or rays of light. When the Greek translation translated that word keren or, it translated it to horns of light. And Michelangelo picked that up and made a Moses with horns. And I was asked in 3rd grade, where are my horns? Because I'm Jewish and Jews have horns. That's the danger of mistranslation. That's the danger of telling a story without knowing what the words mean. That's the danger of medieval portraits of Jews as devilish beings with horns. So I'm going to leave you with that thought, which is a powerful thought. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk a little bit later about some of the things I've presented. But now I'm looking forward to the response. And thank you.
Wow, thank you for this deep dive, Rabbi Goldstein. You gave me so much to think about that every time I went to type, I was listening, I thought, oh, I can't remember what I was typing. But when it seems to me that the first thing that you're saying to us is how important thinking and being in dialogue with one another is, like that that we've asked you here to give us another lens on what is our shared heritage, the dangers and the richness of that. So I just want to explain to people here again that even though I bet everybody is just dying to just leap in and ask a question, we have chosen for this event, because we invite keynote speakers to come who are not biblical tellers per se, then we need to have a lens on biblical telling as well. So what we've chosen to do is to shape our first 3 keynote sessions, Friday, Saturday, by having a presentation and having a response, somebody reflecting on what they've heard or reflecting on the text that they were given through the lens of the biblical teller. And then luckily for you, there'll be time for you to talk because there'll be home group time after this for 30 minutes. And so you'll get a chance to work out and speak together about what has been sparked for you. So here, we have just a little bit of time. So in the mix of what you've been speaking about and what I was thinking as I told the scripture over and over and over, and you notice the fine points, things you never would have noticed if you were even reading deeply. Here are some thoughts, and so I hope there'll be a little time for you to even respond to my response. One of them is that it seems to me that maybe the Jewish community knows a whole lot better than the Christian community that there are translations. Like, it's very common to meet Christians who don't even know that Jesus didn't speak English, or that Moses didn't speak English, and so it's kind of a mind bender for them. But it would seem to me that your heritage would have made it just much more clear that you've been working in a culture with another language, and that things move, and they've also been affected as they've been translated along. I love your words, all translation is interpretation. Of course it is. And as biblical tellers, every time we open our mouth, we're interpreting. And it's a terrible, wonderful power, isn't it? To know that you can say something in a serious way, in a silly way. You can say things that are you can soft pedal some things and you can expand some other things, and know that you are affecting the translation of it. We are a translation. So along with that, it would seem to me that debate, it feels like debate is more a part of the Jewish expectation, the Jewish process, the Jewish faith, than maybe it is in the Christian community. I'm not sure, but my fear is sometimes in our study of Holy Word that our attempt is to drill down and come to the place where we agree. Maybe that's just a Canadian thing. I don't know. But it often feels like that we're trying to come to the place where we're all getting along just great. And that often leaves us at praise the Lord, make a joyful noise, all the earth. Rather than knowing that it's safe and it's good and it's called for, and that every time we just keep plumbing the depths, we'll come to more and then go beyond. That's my sense of the Jewish study method, and it's kind of, I think sometimes it's kind of frightening. And here in an ecumenical context with folks of different kinds of Christians together, it's just scary to get together, and such a beautiful thing. But even then, you have to treat hearing something that is not you yourself, that doesn't sound like the way you would say things, or that sounds like that thing those people say. You have to treat that with welcome. When you say something that is so different from what I would ever say, like to actually say quietly to yourself, "Thank God, I'm not getting my same old again." So that's a whole different mindset that I think my sense is the Jewish community may have better than the Christian one. Anyway.
Can I respond to that?
Sure, you better.
Right for. And just with a quick anecdote story people might find interesting. When I first came to Toronto, I was invited to teach biblical studies to the Sisters of Zion in their convent in Toronto. And I went and I introduced them to the whole world of commentary, which we're going to talk about in session 3 when we talk about Midrash, right? But I introduced them to people like Rashi, who I mentioned before, the 11th century French commentator. And at the end of the session, they said to me the following, I'll never forget it. And this was 40 years ago, so it was obviously stuck with me. They said, "But Rabbi, what's the right answer?
Yeah.
What's the right translation? What's the right interpretation? What does the Bible mean when it says?" And then you can fill in the blank there. And so for Jews, and this is tricky and also sticky, for Jews, when we study, first of all, we take the book, okay? And then around the book, we have other books, because I want to see what the Talmud says about that. And then I want to see what the commentator says about that. Then I want to see what Jewish law says about that. And then I want to see what modern people say about that. So for Jews, we never, ever, ever study just the text. The text alone is never, it's the trunk of the tree, but from the tree branches out commentary, interpretation, poetry, literature, and so we never just end with the trunk, right? And so it can be fractious studying Torah with Jews. I don't know how many of you ever saw the movie Yentl, but the scenes in Yentl of her studying in the yeshiva, in the Jewish study hall, with people shouting at each other, saying, "No, that's the way we study." At the end of the day, what is the right answer is very problematic for us. We look, there's a bottom line that we don't cross over, right? So there's a certain interpretations. If somebody in one of my classes, Bible study classes, raises their hand and says, "Well, this means," and it's so outrageous that it couldn't possibly mean that. As I said before, there's purposeful mistranslations. So I don't believe that Isaiah 7 means a virgin. So there's a moment in which we say the Hebrew doesn't support that interpretation. The original doesn't support that interpretation, but it takes a lot to get there.
That's what I think is one of the gifts of biblical telling, is that it takes us away from this notion that the story that we were given is only this little sort of trick to get you into a place where you can be conned into listening to something that's appetizing so that you can still say, what is the real meaning of this, and get it and be done for life. And often we have to fight against this impulse to just try to find the one right answer and to leave it open. You kind of made me laugh when you said about the folks studying Torah and shouting at one another, shouting each other down, and that's so un-Canadian. And I've often, it just strikes me so funny to then imagine, say, Jesus or Saul of Tarsus speaking, or someone speaking on his behalf, speaking in the town square. And we all Canadians, we imagine, everyone listened very quietly and they respectfully listened to what he had to say. But to turn that around and to imagine heckling, shouting, trying to talk Jesus down, or is more the picture. And but one that's well, it actually changes the word, because if you don't see it as this is the final word of God, it's simple and it's right there, so take it and do it, but you hear it as something that's offered out there in debate, that's totally different, isn't it?
And it's so important, because one of the reasons I'm so excited and gratified to be here is because you said, if you ask the average Christian, do they know how many translations there are? There are Christians who don't know Jesus was a Jew. And by not knowing that, you are losing out on so much context. Remember, I said at the beginning, you have to understand the context. When Jesus is talking about the Pharisees, the Pharisaic tradition is this tradition of interpretation, of back and forth, of shouting each other out, right? Now, Jesus might have been uncomfortable with the way the Pharisees treated him, right? But he is right in the middle of the Pharisaic tradition himself, right? So the way and I'll do this a little bit in our third session, the way Jesus preached was very Jewish, right? And he lived in a Jewish context. And so sometimes by forgetting that, the Christian community has to be reminded of the context. He was Semitic, right? He wasn't Canadian. He was Semitic. He's from the Middle East. So he had that kind of ethnic, if you will, way of being, and he was Jewish. And he was raised in a Jewish milieu. So he taught and preached and understood and learned in that way. So yeah, you have to picture him doing that Pharisaic tradition of interpreting, give and take, back and forth, even yelling at each other.
There are a lot of places where I think that we see the word Pharisee and we immediately think those are the bad guys, and we don't read in respect on Jesus's part. Recently I told a text where the Pharisees say he speaks with authority, and so I was telling that as if they're the bad guys who really don't like him, and they're trying to, and everything they say is wrong. And when I re-understood it as wow, how can he be so young and speak with authority? That was totally different. So to reread respect into the Jewish characters in a story, that's worth Christian study.
And that's why it's so splendid for me as a rabbi to be teaching you in these sessions, because not only does it enrich your understanding of the context of the stories that you're telling, but it also opens that door to understanding each other and makes the world so much of a better place. So I'm just so thrilled to be able to do this.
Totally. Well, we get 2 more sessions with you, and so you're going to cover everything we ever needed to know. I'm gonna leave it like this. What I noticed as a teller is that there is no end to the 7th day. There is evening and morning of every single day of the week. But only as a teller did I notice this, that there is no evening and morning on the 7th day, and it's as if the Sabbath has never ended. I bet you have an entire presentation to do on that. And there is evening and there's morning on our keynote, but this will be the 7th day, I believe. She won't even start. So thank you so much, Rabbi Goldstein, for this, and We are looking so very much forward to the next 2 sessions with you. And of course, you know that others know that Steve Bell is our theme presenter on Saturday, which is the Jewish Sabbath. Catherine, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much to Rabbi Goldstein and to Linnea. I know I can speak for all of us when I say that what you've offered us is so much rich food for thought. I'm really glad that you encouraged us not to take notes. That's all I can say, because I wasn't keeping up at all, really.